Hi, this lecture is on adrenal glands, one of the most important endocrine glands in the field of endocrinology. So today we are going to learn about the anatomy of the adrenal gland and then go into what are the different hormones that it is secreting in order to provide a physiological homeostasis in our body. Okay. So remember, the adrenal hormones or adrenal gland, the hormones secreted by them are steroidal hormones. And the location of the adrenal gland is it sits on top of the kidneys. So these are the kidneys. These are called the renal glands, okay? Sits on top of the kidneys are the adrenal glands. These adrenal glands are also known as suprarenal glands because it sits on top of the renal glands, and as such it is also called as suprarenal glands. They are pyramid shaped and are extremely important for our survival. Okay, the adrenal gland consists of two main tissue. Okay, there is an outermost tissue which is known as the adrenal cortex, which is a glandular tissue and which is basically made up of glands, and the innermost tissue, which is called the medullary tissue, is mainly made up of the nervous tissue. So let's understand the composition, the anatomy, the histology of these different tissues. So as you can see, it consists of two main sections, right? As you can see, it is divided into main parts. The outer part is called the adrenal cortex, and the inner part is called the adrenal medulla. Okay, the adrenal cortex is the outermost part of the gland, as I said, and which basically encloses the adrenal medulla. Cells of the adrenal cortex, which is this layer, and you can see these are the different cortex layers, are divided or arranged in concentric shells or zones. They have different zones in here. You can see these are the different zones in here, and we'll learn about them. The outermost zone is immediately beneath the connective tissue capsule, which is known as the zona glomerulosa. So if you look in here, the first layer just after the connective tissue layer is known as the zona glomerulosa. And the main hormone that it produces is called mineralocorticoids. And we learn why it is called mineralocorticoids, okay? And the main hormone produced by it is aldosterone. Next to it is the zona fasciculata. The zona fasciculata produces hormone which are known as glucocorticoids, and the main hormone produced by it is cortisol. Okay, and we learn why and how important cortisol is in our life. Then comes zona reticularis, which produces androgen, and we'll be touching upon very less into this part of the medulla of the cortex, just because we have already learned about the steroid hormones of males and females, and the importance of this is mainly for lipido, and we will not be touching upon this part of the section. The last or the innermost layer is the adrenal medulla. These are called stress hormones, and the main hormones are epinephrine and norepinephrine. So I want you to understand that these hormones are absolutely necessary for our survival, and each of these parts produces different hormones which are very, very important in our lives. the adrenal glands. There are two adrenal glands on both sides of our body. And if one of these adrenal glands gets damaged or destroyed, the other adrenal gland enlarges in size in order to compensate that phenomenon. Okay, this is important to remember. So let's start with the adrenal cortex and the first layer of it, which is the zona glomerulosa. So we will learn about the zona glomerulosa, but let me go over a simple axis that we have learned before, and this is a little more in depth. So if you remember in previous lectures, we had learned about hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis, right? So this is hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis because we are learning about the adrenal gland. So remember, the hypothalamus actually has cells, and these cells actually are able to produce hormone which is known as corticotropin releasing hormone, which acts on the pituitary to produce corticotropes. These are the cells of the anterior pituitary, which are corticotropes, and these produce a very, very important hormone which is known as adenocorticotropic hormone, adenocorticotropic hormone. And this hormone is released from the anterior pituitary, which acts on the adrenal gland. Okay, now the question is, where does it act? It acts at every level, on all the three layers, but the main action or its main control is on the second layer, which is the glucocorticoids, which produces cortisol, which is mainly responsible for regulation of glucose and stress. Okay, we'll learn about that later on, but I want you to understand there is a role of ACTH in mineralocorticoid production also, which is aldosterone. Okay, going forward, so we are now going to talk about the mineralocorticoids. First and foremost, I want you to understand that these three layers, which is part of the adrenal cortex, which is zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis, each of these layers produces different hormones. As you can see, aldosterone for zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata cortisol, and zona reticularis androgen and or androgendione. So how are these hormones produced? Okay, the starting material. Okay, if you're making a cake, there is a starting material. Okay, flour may be the starting material. Same thing here. When a hormone is made, there is a starting material, and the starting material in case of steroid hormones, as we have learned earlier, is cholesterol. Okay, cholesterol is the starting material for all the three hormones that is produced by these tissues, but the enzymes that are available on those different tissue layers are different. As a result, the production of different hormones are at the different layers of the adrenal cortex. Okay, starting with, let's understand. So I want you to understand a couple of highlighted things in this PowerPoint so that makes sense. That number one, the starting material is cholesterol, and once the starting material is cholesterol from the cytosol moves into the mitochondrial outer membrane, and in here there is an enzyme which is known as P40 side chain cleavage enzyme, and this is present in all three of the tissues, which is able to convert it into pregnenolone. From here on, the pregnenolone actually goes into the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. As you can see it in here, it moves into the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and each of these enzymes converts it into respective product. Okay, in case of aldosterone and cortisol, the outcome, the product is progesterone. But from progesterone onwards, remember, since the zona fasciculata does have 17 hydroxylase, the progesterone is converted into 17 progesterone. And since 17 hydroxylase is not present in the zona glomerulosa, this step does not take place. As a result, the pathway bifurcates. It goes into a different pathway. Now, 21 hydroxylase, very, very important enzyme, is present in both, and in case of zona glomerulosa, it converts progesterone into 11-deoxycorticosterone, all called DOC. And in case of in case of zona fasciculata, it converts 17 progesterone into 11-deoxycortisol. Okay, as such, the last step takes place in the mitochondria. As you can see it in here, both steps are mitochondria, but the product in case of zona glomerulosa is aldosterone, but in case of zona fasciculata, the product is cortisol. So, a couple of information that you need to remember in here is, number one, the starting point is cholesterol. Number two, the first step in the process, which takes place in the presence of P450 side chain cleavage, takes place in the mitochondria. The third, the last step takes place in the mitochondria also, but the intermediate steps takes place in the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Presence of 17 hydroxylase is present in zona fasciculata. As such, the pathway is divided or changing for cortisol, and 21 hydroxylase actually is one of the primary enzymes which is able to change or bifurcate the enzyme pathway. One forms aldosterone in case of zona glomerulosa. In case of zona fasciculata, the end product is cortisol. This actually should help you to understand this PowerPoint and the intermediate steps in here. The highlights of this process are the enzymatic pathway is important, remember. I want you to understand one other thing, is that, as I said, if you remember, cholesterol is the starting point of all of these tissue. Cholesterol is present in the cytosol, remember, okay? It is present in the cytosol. As such, it has to move, it has to come into the mitochondria, okay? There is plenty of cholesterol present, but cholesterol needs to move from the cytosol into the mitochondria, and that process is very, very regulated, okay? So I'm going to go over that in the next slide, which helps you to understand the cholesterol homeostasis in the adrenal, okay? First and foremost, remember, this is a basal state when no exchange is taking place. And this is basically a cell, an adrenal cell that we are talking about. So receptor-mediated endocytosis of low-density lipoprotein is a regulatory event in the cellular cholesterol homeostasis, okay? First, what happens? There's a binding, uptake and degradation of cholesterol-rich lipoprotein particles by the mammalian cells, and that pathway is called LDL receptor pathway. This is an important pathway as it provides a cell with cholesterol, thereby it removes cholesterol-rich lipoproteins from the circulation. And I'm pretty sure all of us understand having high levels of cholesterol in the circulation is not necessary, and what are the pathological symptoms or pathological diseases associated with it. Now let's understand. A negative feedback works in this process, remember, that is overaccumulation of cholesterol causes LDL cholesterol ester to produce a negative effect by suppressing the activities of 3-hydroxy 3-methyl gluteryl CoA synthase and reductase. Okay, what is more important now to understand is the pathway. Okay, so if you look in here, this is the cell and these are the lipoproteins with its receptor. It is able to bring in the cholesterol into the cell, into the mitochondria, where free cholesterol is available and which is in equilibrium with the esterified cholesterol. Okay. So, now this process, now this free cholesterol, once in the cell, needs to go into the mitochondria for its effect. And in that case, there is another enzyme which is involved in the whole process, which is known as STAR, which is a steroid acute regulatory protein, which we have learned when we learned testosterone also. Okay, so once these two are available, these are the starting material. Okay, starting material of making the steroid hormones. And if they are present, the cholesterol homeostasis starts. But this needs ACTH, adrenocorticotropic releasing hormone, or adrenocorticotropic hormone released from the anterior pituitary. Okay, so this is required, and this facilitates the entire process, which helps, number one, to move the esterified cholesterol into free cholesterol, and also activates the steroid acute regulatory protein, which is like a carrier to move it from the cytosol into the mitochondria. Now, if there is prolonged stimulation of ACTH, there is increase in the receptors, more and more, cholesterol or lipoproteins come inside the cell, more and more steroid synthesis takes place. But this is under the negative feedback loop. When there is more than enough steroid proteins or steroid hormones are produced, which can be of any kind, cortisol, aldosterone, androgen, any of them, it will produce a negative feedback loop on the hypothalamus, which in turn has a negative feedback on anterior pituitary, which in turn will have a negative feedback on the release of ACTH. As such, the entire process will slow down or stop. Okay, so this movement or transport of cholesterol from the cytosol into the mitochondria is an essential step, is a required step for all the three hormones to be produced. Okay, so I want you to understand, and there are many hormones, of course, which follow the same rule. All steroid hormones require this step, but it is essential for in the case of adrenal gland. So now we are pivoting into the next part of it. We are going to learn about each of these hormones that are produced by the adrenal gland. We are going to start with the outermost tissue layer, which is known as the zona glomerulosa, as we said. And these hormones produced by this tissue is known as mineralocorticoids. Why? Mineralocorticoids, the name itself should help you to understand minerals. So we are talking about sodium, potassium. Okay, so we are talking about these ions. We are talking about the electrolyte balance in our body. I want you to understand that this electrolyte balance from the extracellular fluid into the intracellular fluid, which is inside the cell, is highly regulated and absolutely necessary for proper functioning of your body. The main hormone that we will be talking about is aldosterone, and some of the main important functions of them is it maintains a sodium balance by reducing the secretion of sodium from the body. So it causes a retention of sodium in the blood. It keeps the sodium in the blood. Okay, so it is responsible for retention of sodium in the body. it stimulates reabsorption of sodium by the kidneys. So pretty much very similar statements. Number 3, blood pressure, very, very related. Blood pressure, remember, blood pressure, sodium. Now sodium we have learned before also when we were learning about cholera, if you remember. Sodium retention, when sodium moves into the blood, moves along with it is water. Okay, so moves along with the sodium is water. So when water in the blood increases, the blood volume increases, right? So if blood volume increases, blood pressure increases. So the aldosterone is responsible for regulation of blood pressure. So blood pressure is regulated by aldosterone, and we'll learn about this a little more detail in the subsequent slide. Circulatory shock, aldosterone is also related with heart pump, stroke volume. As such, in the absence of it, it can lead to circulatory shock also. And in the absence of aldosterone, or in very low amounts if it is produced, it can be fatal. So how is cholesterol, how is aldosterone produced? Okay, so let's understand the synthesis and control of aldosterone. So aldosterone is, we'll come to that. The starting material of aldosterone is angiotensin II, which is produced by the liver. But we have to understand this. It is a plasma protein. So angiotensin II is a plasma protein, but this is produced only and only when kidney produces renin. So the question is, why would kidney suddenly start producing renin? The stimulus for the production of renin is decreased blood pressure. Whenever there is lowering of blood pressure, the kidneys start producing renin. From where it produces renin, I'll go over that in the next slide. But just remember, the kidney produces renin, which causes the liver to produce the plasma protein angiotensinogen. Now, renin basically acts like a scissor. It basically chops down some parts of the amino acid. As such, it is converted into angiotensin I. Angiotensin I, in the presence of an enzyme produced by the lungs, which is known as angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, converts into angiotensin II. Now, this angiotensin II is the main stimulus for the production of aldosterone. It acts on the zona glomerulosa in order to produce aldosterone. Okay, so now the question is, it is producing aldosterone. Now we have just now learned the pathway by which aldosterone is produced. I'm just going to go back a few slides so that it makes more sense. So if you remember, we were talking about production of aldosterone in here. So this is only produced when under the action of angiotensin II. So angiotensin II acts at the different levels. It acts at all of these enzymatic levels. So let's do this. It acts on all of these enzymes in order for aldosterone to be produced. Okay, so angiotensin II facilitates the entire process of production of aldosterone through G protein coupled receptor. So I'm hoping all of you remember that, how G protein activates the cyclic AMP, which acts as a second messenger and which promotes in the production of pKa, and protein kinase A in turn acts at all the enzymes that are responsible for the production of aldosterone. Okay, aldosterone then can act on the kidneys in order to increase, in order to increase the blood pressure. So aldosterone helps in the blood pressure regulation. Okay, multiple ways it does it. It helps, it acts directly on the kidney. How? I'll explain a little later. It can act on the arteries, causing vasoconstriction, increases BP, water retention. And then heart, which produces ANP, which is atrionatritic peptide, it is a negative regulator of aldosterone production. Okay, so what are the main elements that are required for aldosterone production? Number one is angiotensin 2 is required, and number two is, also remember, it is ACTH is required, because ACTH, although is a has a subtle effect on it, but remember the cholesterol movement requires ACTH. So indirectly, ACTH does have an effect on aldosterone production. The negative effect of aldosterone effect, or how it negatively can be affected by the hormone ANP, which is produced from the heart. So now we are just understanding how aldosterone is affecting the kidneys in regulating the blood pressure. So let's do this. So if you remember a little bit review, kidneys are made of the basic unit, which is called nephron. Okay, nephron has two parts. One is known as the renal corpuscles, and the other is known as a renal tubule. Okay, the renal tubule, which we are more interested in here, renal tubule has three parts. Number one is proximal convoluted tubule. Number two, this is the loop of Henle, and the third is a distal convoluted tubule. We are very much interested in this. The distal convoluted tubule actually loops in front, takes a detour or loops in front and comes near the glomerulus. And here you will see there are certain cells in the distal convoluted tubule, which is known as juxtaglomerular cells, which is mainly responsible for production of renin. So I just explained how renin is involved in the renin-angiotensin pathway, and that is produced by these juxtaglomerular cells. Now, what we were learning that how aldosterone is helping in the blood pressure regulation. So I want you to understand that the aldosterone, what it does is able to bring out, or is able to cause retention of sodium from these tubes into the circulation. So the question is, what will happen if the sodium remains in these tubes? Remember, these tubes actually ultimately is going to be connected to the connecting duct, which causes urine. So if it remains in these ducts, it will be excreted out in the form of urine. And we don't want that, right? So we want sodium to come back to the body or be retained in the body, and aldosterone helps in that process. Another point to remember, sodium retention is taking place. Okay, sodium is coming into the blood circulation. What will come along with it? Water will come along with it. Okay, so when water comes along with it and goes into the arteries, you can see these are the blood vessels surrounding it. When the water comes along with sodium, it causes increase in the blood volume. Okay, so increase in the blood volume means increase in the blood pressure. So I want to go back a slide to help you understand. So remember, aldosterone was produced because there was decreased in the BP, okay? In order to combat the decrease in the BP, aldosterone was produced, and aldosterone is successfully able to increase the BP by sodium water retention, and in the process, remember, potassium is excreted out. Okay, so from here, this actually is basically what I just explained in a little bit easier manner. So let's understand this part. If you see, this is the blood pressure, and if blood pressure goes down, it affects the juxtaglomerular cells. Where are these present? These are present in the nephrons of the kidneys, and they produce a hormone which is known as renin. Renin then is able to act on the angiotensinogen to produce angiotensin 1 and 2, and the angiotensin 2 acts on the zona glomerulosa to produce aldosterone. Aldosterone in turn is able to retain or increase sodium ions in the blood. Once that happens, blood pressure comes back. Okay, and this is just the opposite pathway. So now that we know that aldosterone is able to cause sodium retention, there has been certain theories that have come up that helps us to understand some of the pathways by which it does it. Number one is, remember, aldosterone is a steroid hormone, so it is lipid soluble. It can go inside the cell cytoplasm. It has nuclear or cytoplasmic receptor, and it acts as a DNA dependent RNA synthesis, which leads to formation of protein, that is transcription, translation, and protein synthesis. This protein synthesis helps what is called in three different ways. Number one, what it does is it is able to act on the sodium potassium pump. If you remember from your from your experience, or if you've taken cell biology, you might know that the sodium potassium pump, which is present on the cell surface, is involved in bringing sodium